Hello and welcome to this video on Lembas bread. This is the semi-mythical travelling food of the elves in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit and extended works. The bread is described as a cake that will keep sweet for many days if unbroken and kept in a leaf wrapping. They will keep a traveller on their feet for a day of long labour, even if they are one of the tall people. This makes it a fatty version of a Twinkie. The actual Lembas bread is further described as being very nutritious, staying fresh for months when kept in a melon leaf, giving great sustenance, being light brown in colour on the outside and the colour of cream on the inside. It was made of a meal that was baked thin and crisp. It was also described as being a waffle-like product. The word corn is also used when describing what was used to create this, although corn may be something of a change in language over time. It's supposed to be offensive to creatures corrupted by evil, as with all elvish products. It also has a slight warning label, in that it can be a dangerous food for any race who does not share the immortality of elves, for if eaten too often, it turns the consumer away from other foods. With this much information, we can extrapolate and theorize as to what Lembas bread might be. We already know that by its very nature, it's a bread, and normal bread is arguably nutritious. It is high in calories and therefore able to provide energy for a long time. At one point, a loaf of bread a day and beer was considered working class food and what you would eat over one 24-hour period. One slice of bread is roughly equal in size and volume to a piece of Lembas bread, so we can draw some comparisons there. One slice of standard wheat bread is about 32 grams. This equates to about 82 calories, 1 gram of fat, 1.9 grams of fibre, 1.4 grams of sugar, and 4 grams of protein. This is a very far stretch to the daily calorie requirements, let alone fat, protein, and so on. The average adult needs about 2,000 calories a day, and this only goes up with physical activity, let alone hiking to Mordor. To reach nominal daily intake, a single slice of bread needs to be 25 times more calorie dense than normal bread would be. By comparison, a military ration pack that is meant to achieve the same result has 4,000 calories. It is far larger and certainly more varied than Lembas bread. However, much of this, at least in the calories, comes from a few limited items that are sugar rich, and as a result, very high in calories. This opens the first way Lembas bread may work. Sucrose or table sugar. These have about 387 calories per 100 grams. You would need more than 500 grams of pure sugar to meet your needs. Clearly, this is not going to work very well. A very large, very solid, very heavy block of sugar doesn't really fit with the image seen. Another option would be something nut-derived. Flours that are both nut-derived and extremely dehydrated to minimize weight and volume. For example, pecans have 691 calories per 100 grams, along with protein, fats, and fiber. Unfortunately, pecans only have about 3.5% water content. This makes dehydrating it marginally better. This idea might be a way to make Lembas bread work at a calorific level. It could be reinforced by dehydrated oils to further add calories, act as a binding agent, and to give flavour. That would give us a roughly 200 to 250 gram foodstuff, with approximately 50% more calories than the milled nuts alone. Even if we generously assume the possibility is true, it would still need considerable amounts or a very high density. To have Lembas bread be about the size of a slice of bread, or somewhere in the region of an 11 by 11 by 1 centimeter foodstuff, approximately 121 cubic centimeters, we need to then look at how dense it's going to be on a 1 centimeter cube basis. Assuming that we can somehow fit the 200 to 250 grams into the 121 cubic centimeters, we now have 2.41 grams a cubic centimeter. That may not sound like a lot, but this is close to the density of granite, which is 2.6 to 2.7 grams a cubic centimeter. Water alone should only be 1 gram. Very few people are able to eat rocks, but they can drink water. The hope would be that the use of oils would substantially break the structural strength of Lembas bread structure. This is why butter and other oils are used in shortbread and short crust pastry. They prevent the cross-linking of the various components of it, and therefore prevent it from becoming solid. This raises one big problem as well, and perhaps the solution. It's described as made of a meal that was baked thin and crisp, also being described as a wafer. Most foodstuffs that are described as being waffle-like tend to be able to shear quite easily on the horizontal plane. This is very similar to what the rock called slate does. It's extremely strong in the vertical plane, but extremely weak on the horizontal plane. This means it can break readily into layers, and those individual layers are much weaker than the whole. As a result, in theory, Lembas bread, if it is baked in such a way that there are multiple thin layers, could be weak, or at least weak enough, that you could break it horizontally, creating thin layers that are both smaller in total volume, but also individually weak enough to be broken on the vertical axes. This would allow the food to be easily consumed, even if it had a very high density. In order to be able to make it, we also need to consider just what you're going to use and the colour. Using nuts that we've described could produce similar results as the use of almond meal. Almond meal is light in colour inside when baked, that is the colour of cream, and darkens somewhat on the surface. Lembas bread was described as being light brown on the outside and the colour of cream on the inside. While certainly there's no specific nut needed for this, the high oil, sugar, and protein content of it would make it an option, and we would just need to find something that would match the coloration. An important note is that when you read the books and the various extra work, the elves explain that Lembas bread is made from grain. Well, the books do say corn, but in Old English, corn was a universal term for grains, and what we call corn is usually called maize in those circumstances. In this case, it seems unlikely that the elves would have large estates growing grain in fields, especially when you consider where most of the elvish locations are. Deep in forests, in relatively isolated mountainous areas, and with almost no cities to speak of now. In the Third Age, all the cities were gone, long since destroyed, barring a few limited locations which were the last of the holdouts. Assuming that the elves aren't growing their own particular product in fields, but would instead be trading for it, we then need to look at what they could be growing in those areas. Orchards are the most likely explanation, and nuts from those orchards would be the inevitable product used, given, as we've mentioned, the particular benefits of being high in calories, protein, lipids, and other essential nutrients. This means that although the term corn is used in the books, it could theoretically be a more broad reference to something that has been milled like a grain. The final question is, why would it be offensive to those of a darker persuasion? Such selective toxicity is largely unheard of in closely related, or at least largely developed creatures. In Tolkien's world, there are a number of such reactive species. The elves respond badly to the dark speech of Mordor, Gollum cannot stand elvish rope, and there is the matter of the light of Erandil and Shelob. While we know that humans like alcohol and can survive drinking it in small doses without lasting effects, and despite what Twitch Thoughts might claim otherwise, some of our best friends cannot make the same claims. Cats and dogs, for instance, struggle with even small doses of ethanol which can kill them. Presumably, given the size difference between an orc and a human, you would imagine that they could deal with a larger dose than what a cat or a dog would when compared to a human. And if it's true that a human can consume Lembas bread, and there are addictive qualities to it, it would be fair to argue that it's possible that there is some degree of toxicity present for orcs and other creatures of mortal that aren't going to be present in humans when we look at the effects the food has. If it's not outright toxic, then it might be something much more mundane. It could be that the food is incredibly unpalatable. Something similar to the way some people perceive the taste of coriander or cilantro as being that of soap. If you were to find that that effect was either greater or stronger, it may not be that the food itself is offensive in terms of they react violently, but that the taste is so bad that they react violently. That factor might also play into the claim that Lembas bread can be a dangerous food for any race who does not share the immortality of the elves. As is described, if too much is eaten, it turns the consumer away from real food. The effect is also described as imparting a sense of immortality, if somewhat ephemerally. This becomes more and more alluring while the desire for normal food becomes less and less. How it suppresses appetite may be a two-part process. One is to increase dependency on the Lembas bread by stimulating pleasure centers in the brain. The other is to suppress appetite. There are various foods and dietary supplements that currently claim that they can suppress appetite and are used during periods of famine, or at least traditionally used during periods of famine. By doing both, only Lembas bread would satisfy the demand of a food that causes addiction and suppress appetite. There is also one other possibility that Lembas bread, when described this way, raises. It could be something similar to a very crudely refined amphetamine-like stimulant. This would explain the size, small amount needed, and effect observed. Drugs like amphetamines were used throughout World War I and II in order to make it possible for soldiers to be active for longer, not need to stop, and not need to eat, while still having lots of energy to do their job. Lembas bread could be having a similar effect, where while it's said to be able to keep someone on their feet all day, it might not actually be providing them with the necessary energy, but rather the illusion that they have the energy and have recovered their strength to keep going. Overall, as we've described it, it is possible, but we are left wondering how elf magic fits that many calories into something so small and keeps it edible. As mentioned, very few people take great pleasure in chewing on rocks. Assuming elf magic is the answer, everything else makes sense. You can, to a certain degree, make it work, so long as you are willing to be a little bit flexible in the numbers, and adapt the language to be more appropriate to what materials are available and the kinds of ingredients we know that would have the properties needed based on what has been described. It could also be a drug-filled plant material deceptively described as magical food. Nobody should trust the elves. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you might have below.